I'm Mark. I'm going to talk about our joint collaboration with CISPA and ETH, and more particular, this is joint work with Giovanni, Pascal, Mirdola, and Sergen. So what are we talking about today? I will just briefly recap what a CAN bus is. I think for some of you, this is very familiar, especially those who have attended the workshop on Monday. CAN bus is a robust serial bus protocol that's mostly used in vehicles. It's very old, decade-old standard. And it's mostly used to connect the electronic control units. These are units that control the sensors in a car and can be very safety critical sensors, such as airbags, ABS, suspension, but also multimedia and other systems are connected to the CAN bus these days. What does the CAN bus look like on the physical layer? It's just a twisted pair of wires with multiple nodes. And this the CAN bus can be either in recessive or dominant state. Dominant state meaning it's a logical zero, meaning we have kind of a voltage differential of around 2 volts on the lines. And if you're in recessive states, both wires have the same voltage potential. What do these nodes look like? So they're mostly comprised of a CAN transceiver, which is the element that translates the logical layer into the physical layer and vice versa. And we also have a CAN controller that makes sure that all the nodes adhere to the CAN standards, such as the rules of arbitration, which I'll briefly talk about later. These CAN controller can also, with newer systems, it's often fully integrated into in silicon and in the microcontroller itself. What do CAN bus frames look like? I already alluded to it. So these nodes or ECUs, they only transmit when the bus is idle, generally, and synchronization. So if everyone can transmit at any time, we need some form of synchronization. How this is achieved is through arbitration, and you see here there is an arbitration information element in the frame. The first part, it can be in standard CON, this is 11 bits. And this ID kind of defines who gets to send. So if 2 nodes should transmit at the same time, whoever transmits a 0, which is the dominant bit, then gets to continue with its transmission, and the other node simply backs off. So logically also safety critical messages have way higher priority, right? So braking system and all these have higher priority than what you would assign to multimedia system in the car. What is the main problem with CAN bus? I think this should also be familiar with a lot of you. There's no authentication whatsoever, no message or sender authentication. And this leads to so-called masquerade attacks. We have seen many papers over the years also at NDSS about this problem. Usually what happens is that a low priority node is compromised, such as the multimedia system through a vulnerability in Bluetooth or similar. And then this system kind of pretends to be a safety critical system and can kind of transmit the messages on behalf of that node, leading to emergency braking or you name it, basically. Yes, so what are basically the main problems we deal with, or the attacker model? What's commonly found in CAN bus literature so far is a remote attacker, which is someone kind of compromising. What I just briefly summarized in the previous slide is someone compromising a node and then gaining control over that node and exploit the vulnerability and on the CAN bus itself. However, with this attacker is very limited to kind of the interface provided by the CAN controller. So here on the right side, we see kind of this would be represented the attacker on the left. So just compromising the microcontroller and can then kind of interface and interact with the transceiver. We do, however, believe that, especially nowadays, we also need to consider a second attacker, which we call physical layer attacker. And this attacker is kind of way more powerful. It can attach its own proprietary devices to the bus. And you might now ask, well, how likely is this to happen? But we see a lot of like devices that people attach to their cars, such as here in the bottom right. This is like an open pilot system, I think. You can install this below your dash to upgrade your car to support lane keep and other things. if you have an older car. And these devices, for instance, have 4G connectivity, but are directly hooked up to the CAN bus. So what could possibly go wrong? But then also we have other things. Newer CAN bus systems have an attached point at the trailer hitch, which is kind of easily accessible by anyone walking past your car. Then also what we see a lot are so-called gasoline like kind of enhancers or MPG enhancers, where people kind of plug something into their OBD port, which is directly hooked up the CAN bus, and this allegedly this should improve your gas mileage, which of course it doesn't at all. But yeah, someone could embed their own circuitry in this device. What are possible solutions? We can of course introduce cryptography. This has been suggested many times in academia, but also industry. However, this has not found any adaptation in automotive industry. Then even it's actually going quite the opposite. NXP has about a year ago, they announced a chip which provides secure CAN without cryptography. We don't know exactly what it does. It's all under NDA, but we have some ideas. Another, of course, approach which is done mostly in very new vehicles is network segmentation, where we have multiple buses which then have a so-called gateway or router in between. What's being looked at a lot in research in our community are so-called like intrusion detection systems, where we measure features like voltage and timings. And now, of course, what I'm going to talk today, time difference of arrival. So this is basically, how do these intrusion systems work? It's kind of an alternative to encryption or authentication. And we can basically extract physical layer features, as I just said. However, this comes with a huge drawback. We need to have a model that's trained and also retrained, because as you can see here, we have cars can be in a variety of different environmental conditions, and we have slightly different timings, slightly different resistance or capacitance at the connectors, which can all mess with your model. So can we actually use time difference of arrival to the rescue? Because this is, at least by 3 papers, is proposed to be a feature that's very resilient to these environmental changes. And how does it work? We simply have kind of multiple or at least 2 measurement points on the bus. And if a node transmits, we measure the time or the time difference between the arrival times. And this should directly represent a position, which again should then be with this you can then infer the identity of the transmitting node, right? Because we could think of building a mapping when the car is manufactured, so we know which node is at what location. So where does our contribution come in? So we actually looked at this time difference of arrival as a physical quantity. And even though previous studies suggested that this is really a good feature, cannot be modified, we showed that this can indeed be manipulated even by a remote attacker. And this can then again lead to these masquerade attacks where someone can transmit on behalf a safety critical node. So we divide our attacks into 2 types. First, spoofing, where an attacker tries to alter its own TDoA, and then also poisoning, where an attacker can alter a victim's TDoA during retraining and kind of mess with the model, such that later on a message will indeed be accepted as stemming from the victim node. So there's a main building block for all these attacks, which is called message overshadowing. There's also other attacks. I'll briefly cover them in a bit. But the main building block is message overshadowing. And the idea is that multiple nodes can transmit at the same time on the CAN bus. The CAN bus is actually designed to do this, especially during arbitration phase, which I talked about in the beginning, where nodes need to figure out who has higher priority, and then that node will continue transmitting. So we can actually, for the spoofing attack, we can have 2 colluding attackers. For the poisoning, we can have an attacker that synchronizes to the victim and then also transmits at the same time as the victim. How this synchronization is done, I won't go in detail, but if we have a remote attacker, we can exploit some of the rules of CAN bus. Especially one major drawback is that the buses are usually very busy, so we have a lot of messages following the other. So we can use the CAN bus itself to synchronize two nodes. For a physical attacker, we just, in our analysis, we assume arbitrary synchronization precision. So the effect is that then we have two nodes which have two distinct values of TDoA, but when they transmit together, we can kind of still come up with a TDoA from another node that's in between. I will now briefly just talk about two examples of attacks. So in the paper, we talk about more types, but I think this is the one that's very approachable. So here we have a physical layer adversary that controls at least two nodes. So we have the attacker 1 and 2. And if he has arbitrary precision and very good clocks, he can actually spoof any location in between. And this is just the fact that we assume this is a linear system where the messages travel with some fraction of speed of light. And then the attackers, the attackers can add an artificial delay between their transmissions. So in this example, actually, attacker would transmit shortly after attacker 1. And if we're talking about a falling edge, so falling edge meaning that the transition is from a dominant bit to a recessive, then because CAN bus is basically acts as a wired OR, so if one node transmits dominant and the whole bus is dominant, we see that basically then the reflected location will be here on the left side. And the attacker can, but of course, also introduce a different delay that will be effective for a rising edge. And for a rising edge, the spoofed location would be here on the dotted line or the dashed line on the right side. So this is, of course, if we have perfect synchronization and physical layer attack. I will briefly also talk about the poisoning attack here with remote attacker. So to give you an example how this would work how this works in practice. So here we have a remote attacker that synchronizes to a target node, and due to the clock and they're not being like very precise, and especially in these con nodes, we measured clock jitters that are quite high. We have some imprecision. However, an attacker can still synchronize very well to a target, and then basically inject a message while listening to the target's transmission. And here we can see on the right the example of a falling edge, right? So we have 2 volts potential, which goes down to 0 volts, and the attacker can then simply delay this transition a little bit. And what is seen by the bus is the red line and not the black line, meaning that actually the transmission now has the measured TDoA of the transmission is indeed the position of the attacker and not the position of the target. On the left side, nothing really happens, right? Because the transmission will roughly arrive at the same time. Then, we have, of course, other attack types, not just based on overshadowing. We can not just delay and anticipate edges, which are either dominant or recessive. We can also increase bus load or do other physical layer attacks, such as adding resistance or capacitance, or inject extra pulses or noise, which is something we have also tried. You can see this here at the bottom, the figure where we try to add additional edges, so the TDoA mechanism would be confused to about where actually the bit starts, and possibly this will then alter the TDoA reading. So along with the discovery of these new attacks, we also developed our own approach. I'm not going to go over all the features it has, but the most important ones. So we kind of decode all the messages in our IDS. It decodes all the messages. It measures the TDoA for both the rising and the falling edges, as well as it measures the inter-packet variance. And this we found is very important because most existing approaches so far, they make the decision based on one transition, one edge, and this obviously is not necessarily very accurate. because an attacker can also decide to only modify part of the message. In addition with that, we have many other checks. We check that we actually fully decode the message, and then we check the number of the edges and see if there's inconsistency there, if we have have the right number of transitions. Yeah, here again, I give an example why the intra-packet variance is so important. On the left, you can see what we have measured with our setup, the probability density function of multiple nodes transmitting. And the most important one is here DH, which is an attacker that has compromised node D and H. And you see the little green hump. The green hump would actually be successful at tricking the system and making the system believe that such a transmission is indeed from node F, which would be the benign node at this very position. Yeah, so we showed that this is indeed possible even with the remote attacker. But however, there is an increased variance, which we can detect. This is due to the clocks. On the right side, you see how actually the TDoA readings change based on the number of edges in the packet. And we see we have actually two very distinct lines. These would be the blue ones. This is where actually the two nodes are located that the attacker has compromised. But then due to the clock being there slight be a shift between the two clocks, we see that actually the attacker can indeed realize also points between the nodes, which is due to this clock inaccuracy. However, this of course becomes detectable if you measure all the edges, if you measure the variance over all the edges. We have also implemented this based on a very cheap FPGA board. Some of you might recognize the board on the right. This is like used in a lot of courses at university. It's the Basis 3, I think, board is about $150. Some might have spent also tinkering with this. Our implementation is based on is fully FPGA based. So we took an open source core for a CAN bus decoder and coupled this with a time digital converter. And this is very effective in this scenario because we can very quickly measure all the edges of all the packets, contrary to some of the previous approaches where usually these the TDoA times are based on simply sampling in analog domain, sampling the whole transmission and then detecting edges. Yeah, it's based on time digital delay lines. I'm not going to go in detail here. For some who are interested, feel free also to catch me afterwards. The brief thing is, we have basically the input of the two edges, and then we have kind of a chain of delay elements and a chain of flip-flops. And then after the flip-flops, basically you can think of this, the edge going from left to right through this chain, and then changing the flip-flops. And then when the stop signal arrives, it freezes the flip-flops, and then you can just read out the value of the flip-flops, which should directly correlate with the TDoA with the delay value. We also extensively tested our system and did some sort of ablation study to figure out which parts are really instrumental to detecting attacks, and we can detect all remote attacks. However, of course, if you have physical layer attacks with perfect clock synchronization, even our system struggles. And here I'm not going to bore you with the whole table, but we see that intra-packet variance is indeed very important, something we suggest in our paper compared to previous work. And yes, with this, I would like to conclude. We show that CAN bus is indeed vulnerable to masquerade attacks, even if based on TDoA. TDoA can be a promising feature to really verify the identity and the location of the transmitting nodes. However, we need to be aware there's quite a few poisoning and spoofing attacks possible. And we have proposed a system based on a cheap FPGA board that has shown to be very resilient to remote attackers and also shown some success on physical layer attackers. And then with this, I would like to answer any questions.
How practical do you think TDoA solutions are taking into account the fact that the automobile industry is not like any extra wire. So the fact that you're actually measuring the time in two less locations, that might not be like maybe the automotive industry.
It's very point. We actually implement our both us like security earbone implemented model like fire ears both sides and probably tools to this. So you would need like the length of a boss and think of arguing.
Yeah, well, like, would that be more applicable on buses that are not linear? So for example, some buses would go around the car, so like the distance between two ends might be actually shorter.
Without these two circular sections, really that's any really. Or if you shape the shape boxes that keep on it to some integrity, like in my record to lead you rather notes because yeah. So where this work, so there was like here's work. I guess we began more to make it small crotches on yours here there like and was scrap. You will. Okay, I will pass other folks to ask their questions offline because we were a little bit over time.